Good morning. This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome the witnesses. Thank you for your written testimony. Looking forward to this hearing on really how do we come to grips with our regulatory burden in terms of some kind of regulatory budget, some kind of process for subtraction. Certainly one thing I've learned in my 4.5 years here in Washington, D.C. is everything seems to be additive. And of course, we have over the decades added layer upon layer upon layer, I could keep going, of law and rules and regulation, which are becoming quite burdensome. One of the things I'm always trying to attempt to do is really grab America by the lapels so they understand the extent of this problem. And the problem with the regulations, unless you're on the front lines, unless you're a compliance officer in a business, unless you're an innovator, distracted from innovating and creating and building a business and creating jobs, distracted by the fact that you've got to comply with layer upon layer of federal and state regulations, you really don't understand really how corrosive and harmful all of this regulatory overreach has become in terms of growing an economy, allowing businesses that create products and services that we all actually do value, and as a result, growing a business to create the kind of good jobs that we all are seeking for the American public. A couple of ways I try and quantify it is we've had a number of studies that try and calculate what the cost of the regulatory burden is. We've had some estimates as high as $2 trillion. Well, again, we're immune to these enormous numbers. So let me put that in perspective for folks. Only 9 economies in the world are larger than $2 trillion. That's whether you completely buy into that figure, it gives you some measure of the depth, the size of the problem, the onerous nature of the regulatory burden. Another way of looking at this is, if you remember in 2009 during the debate over the health care law, I know there are a lot of people really concerned about the fact that we were spending 1/6 of our economy on health care. Again, trying to heal ourselves, get well, cure diseases. Well, that 1/6 of our economy is about $2.5 trillion. So there's a lot of time and effort put into trying to contain and control $2.5 trillion worth of expenditure on health care. Where's the outrage? Where's the sense of urgency to try and control a $2 trillion regulatory burden? Another way of kind of putting this in perspective is understanding how we create all these regulations. We don't seem to pass laws anymore in this Congress. What we do is we pass frameworks. 2 examples, both Dodd-Frank and Obamacare were somewhere between 350 and 380,000 words when they were enacted. This is about a year ago when I had my staff check into this. About a year ago, Dodd-Frank was already up to 15 million words, about 43 times the size of the original legislation. Obamacare was over 12 million words, about 32 times the size. So again, I'm just trying to put into context the extent of this regulatory burden because, again, unless you are one of those business owners or a compliance officer having to deal with complying with regulations, being distracted from your primary goal of growing a business, growing an organization, providing products and services we all want, we really don't understand collectively what this burden really is. So the purpose of this hearing is to lay out that reality and then start trying to grapple with some ways we can come up with a subtractive process as opposed to strictly additive. And we've got a representative here from the Canadian government that I think has come up with something that is certainly began in the UK, a 1-in, 1-out rule. I mentioned that I'd be all in favor of a 1-in, 10-out rule, but I'll be happy with incremental success. So we're looking for that kind of testimony. So I do ask consent that my written statement be entered in the record. And with that, I'll turn it over to our other chairman, Senator Mike Enzi. This is a somewhat unusual hearing. We were combining our Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs together with the Budget Committee because these are sort of dual jurisdiction. We thought this was a pretty interesting hearing for all of our members. So, Senator Enzi. Professor Pierce, I'll start the round of questioning with a question for Mr. Clement. Now, Mr. Clement, how difficult has it been, because we've heard a number of people talk about the potential dangers of just having to eliminate a regulation if you're going to implement a new one. How difficult has it been in Canada for you to identify regulations to eliminate? You're
Not that difficult at all, Senator. Of course, by requiring each department and agency to basically do an audit of what they had in stock as regulations on the books, that gave them an idea about which regulations were still meaningful in the 21st century. And so as president of the Treasury Board, what we do at the beginning of every meeting is we have a ledger, because we're basically the board that does approve new regulations as well as looking at expenditures of government. And so at the start of each board meeting, we'll have a ledger, and if there is a department or agency that's proposing a new legislation, a new regulation rather, they also have a period of time during which they can find an out for the in that they're putting in. And so they're given a period of time in which to do that. They don't have to do that immediately because there might be some immediacy to the regulation, but within a defined period of time, within 24-month period, they have to find an out. And so I keep a ledger of each regulatory department and agency. And so far, there's been no issue. And in fact, in some cases, in order to build up some bandwidth for proposed new regulations that they are anticipating with their regulatory agenda, some departments and agencies remove regulations to create a credit for themselves, which then they can then withdraw from at the appropriate time when they are creating new regulations.
So this really has created a cultural shift, a real discipline to the process. I think you mentioned testimony, 129,000 different regulations in Canada. Is there any assessment as a result of this culture shift, this discipline, that would indicate how many of those are going to be potentially on the chopping block? I mean, how many of those 129,000 might be eliminated? Do you have a feel for that?
Well, we're not going to run out of time for those. This is going to be an ongoing exercise. And by culture shift, I'm a politician as well. I have to get reelected. I've noticed, maybe this happens in other jurisdictions as well, but whenever there's an issue that comes to the fore, media issue or what have you, people start to light their hair on fire and run around in circles in Ottawa and say, what do we do? What do we do? We've got this issue. And what the normal go-to position had always been, well, if we only pass this regulation, that issue will go away. And what we've done is we've created a cost to that kind of thinking, because now they've got to think about what regulations they want to remove from the books in order to pass that regulation. And there might be 15 other ways to solve the problem, the public policy problem that is exercising the minds of somebody or another, that don't involve regulating, particularly on small businesses. And so what we've done is created a discipline within the system by adding to the internal cost of thinking about regulation that shifts them to find other ways to resolve the public policy issue that does not involve overregulation of small business.
So again, in the past, everything in Canada, like the U.S., has been additive, and you've come up with a process for subtraction.
Exactly right.
Yeah, what a concept. Professor Dudley, you're certainly aware of the fact how challenging it is to calculate these things, costs, benefits. In a perfect world, we'd have perfect information on that. I am a little concerned in terms of how this administration has handled the calculation of benefits. In President Obama's executive order issued in 2011, his direction to OIRA, in terms of calculating the benefits, he included equity, human dignity, fairness, and distributive impacts. That seems to be a loophole in terms of calculating benefits you can drive a Mack truck through. I mean, can you just talk about the appropriateness of that type of loose language and how easy it becomes to certainly calculate benefits that far exceed costs?
In an ideal world, we would have all the information on the consequences of a regulation before we issue it. So both the costs and the benefits. There will be equitable impacts on the cost side. There will be efficiency impacts. So all those impacts would affect either side of the ledger. In an ideal world, we would have all that information before we made the decision. We will never have that. I do have a concern that there is a greater emphasis on finding those not indirect or other types of things on the benefit side of the ledger than on the cost side.
Are you aware, has anybody really said about doing a study in terms of the opportunity cost on people that are trying to innovate, trying to produce products and services, just in terms of, again, it's as in Canada, they're taking number of hours times number of businesses times wage rates to come up with a cost or kind of defined formula. But again, it's very difficult. Has anybody estimated just the cost, the opportunity cost of regulations on our economy?
There are some estimates, and I don't know how reliable they are. It's tricky to do. It is.
Professor Pierce, again, you were obviously, and again, I agree, cost-benefit analysis is exactly what you need to go through, but again, it's difficult to come up with exactly those numbers. Do you know how many rules or regulations have actually been eliminated in the U.S. over the last 10 years?
No.
Is that something do you think that the federal government ought to keep track of?
Yes, I don't know whether the Professor Dudley's office takes on that responsibility or not.
Professor Dudley?
As I think you mentioned, Dick, or Professor Pierce, we're friends, so we have to be careful to treat each other respectfully here. Each administration, the last 3 presidents, have required agencies to look back and try to remove them. I think there is some tracking of that, but I don't know how accurate or robust it is.
But again, the fact of the matter is we've dramatically increased the number of rules, regulations, laws, haven't done a real good job of eliminating them, right? Once they're on the books, they just stick around there, and it's been very difficult to remove them. Isn't that a basic fact? Professor Pierce?
I think there has been a net increase in the number of rules, but that, because of the way rules are issued, that means there's been a net increase in social benefits, because each of those rules had to go through the benefit cost analysis and then review by OIRA. So if there has been, and I believe there has been, an increase in rules, that has been accompanied by an increase in net social benefits of regulation.
Again, my concern is there's always going to be a bias to overstate the benefits and understate the cost. Again, with this executive order, including equity, human dignity, fairness, distributive impacts, I mean, that's, again, a pretty large loophole. Senator Enzi, Chairman Enzi. You've been involved in this issue for quite a few years. I think my intro said for 38 years. From my standpoint, the reason you have rule of law, one of the reasons, is to create certainty, to lay out the rules of the road, things like a uniform commercial code. Extremely valuable. You have national standards to govern interstate commerce. Do you think the regulatory environment today creates a higher level of certainty than it did 38 years ago in your experience? Have we improved certainty?
That's a hard question to answer, and
I can
I'm
answer.
not at all sure that we have.
But let me ask it a different way. Do you think it's easier or harder to start a company, to build a company, to create jobs? Is it easier or harder 38 years later?
I don't know.
Well, I can tell you, talking to countless business executives who've told me independently, they weren't around and coming up to me and say, Ron, there's no way I could start my business and build it the way I have if I had to start it in this regulatory environment. And that's from multiple people, very successful, just taking a look at what's happening. Professor Dudley, you seem like you wanted to weigh in on this.
I don't have statistics on it. I know surveys of small businesses say that it's harder, but I don't have data.
Mr. Clement, you were an entrepreneur yourself. I mean, again, Canada is different than the U.S. By the way, has anybody conducted a study in Canada in terms of the overall cost of regulatory burden of your 129,000 regulations? Some estimate.
So we have a study done by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, which we rely on. They are an independent body representing small business owners in Canada. And their costing of the impact of regulation of all levels of government, not just the federal level, but provincial. We have the provincial, like your state level, and then the local municipal level, is about $30 billion in the Canadian economy. Okay. So it's quite substantial, similar to what some of the numbers that yourselves were mentioning here in the United States of America. And clearly that is, as Prime Minister Harper said, that's the silent job killer that we have to start talking about and taking seriously.
It would be interesting to compare, because studies we have, Senator Enzi was talking about 1,880 billion, or I'd like to say close to 2 trillion.
Yeah.
So it'd be really interesting to compare those different studies to find out what the real comparison is. Mr. Clement, you also made an interesting comment about the fact that regulators have never been involved in the private sector. I want you to expound on that a little bit more, because certainly that's what I find too. I mean, if you don't understand the burden, if you're just here thinking of all these wonderful benefits of your agency's new regulation, you really don't have much sympathy for really the compliance burden, do you?
Right. So in our case, Senator, what I can say is there is a little bit of entering and exiting the private sector world at the senior levels of the bureaucracy, but that's usually with larger businesses. That's certainly the evidence that I have found, is that they usually go to larger firms who have large compliance departments, lots, armies of lawyers and accountants and whatnot who can help the company deal with the compliance cost of doing business. It is not usual, at least in our political culture, for senior public servants or any public servants to have that experience with small business. I'm not condemning them from that. It's just the way it is. And so what we have tried to do was at least sort of build that into the consultation process, because it was not natural in the culture of the place before we started this initiative. And just to expound on it just very briefly, we're legislators. We're legislators, and because I'm part of the executive branch, we have the executive part of our business as well. So, the whole system is erected so that if you face a problem, which we all want to solve, that's why we're in politics in the first place. We want to solve problems and make sure our country does better. So the first go-to point is you either legislate or you regulate. That's kind of how the place was built. And so what we're trying to do is change the culture so that they realize that there are other mechanisms and tools available that maybe the only way, as Senator Stabenow, in some cases, the only way forward is legislation and regulation. I'm not denying that. But in many cases, there are other more creative ways that can be found that can deal with the public policy issue that does not involve legislation and regulation. And we have to sort of nudge, you do more nudging and less using the hammer in all situations.
Trust me, the bias is toward addition. Writing new pieces. I mean, after all, we are legislators, so we intend to legislate. So we need to have something subtractive. Professor Pierce, you made an interesting comment about how, when we exempt small businesses from some of these regulations, then the large corporations game the system. Do you have any good example of that? Because I think I see that all the time.
I've seen many examples of it described in the literature. One that I recall offhand is FCC auctions, where small businesses are given preferences, and then when you look at what the small business is, it's not so small. It's got 100,000 employees, and they've just created a subsidiary for the purpose of participating in the auction, getting the benefit. Unfortunately, we see the same kinds of problems fairly frequently with respect to preferences for minority-owned businesses and female-owned businesses, that as soon as you provide any benefit, there are going to be people who hire good lawyers to figure out how to take advantage of the benefit. And that creates a real problem for you. It creates a real problem for the people who write the rules in the agencies. And I don't have a real easy fix for that problem.
I think one of the things we have to do if we're going to do a regulatory budget is we have to calculate the cost of the unintended consequences, which is really kind of the definition of Washington, D.C. One last question for Professor Dudley. In terms of, because you've been involved in this issue for quite some time as well, and we have the Administrative Procedures Act. What's your sense in terms of executives, presidents, the executive branch following that Administrative Procedures Act? Is there greater compliance or less compliance, or is it pretty much about the same?
You know, I'm not sure the answer to that. I think it's about the same, that because it is required by law, and we are such a litigious society that if agencies don't follow the procedures and get notice and comment, they can be sued. I have seen a couple of things lately I'm very curious about. The trans fat announcement that was made just this week, I don't think that went through notice and comment. So there are some things that I'm curious about, but
And we do know that President Obama's executive amnesty has been basically, there's a stay because he did not follow the Administrative Procedures Act as well. So there are certainly different evidences of that. Senator Chairman Enzi, do you have any further questions?
I
For the
have
record.
some questions that I'll send in that will become a part of the record later,
Okay.
I hope. But, yeah.
Well, with that then, again, I just want to thank our witnesses for your taking the time, your thoughtful testimony, your thoughtful answers to our questions. This hearing record will remain open for 15 days until July 8th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.